Where's Richard? Hey, come on up, brother. So the idea tonight is to share with you some pictures that we took on our trip to Israel. And this trip is organized by a group by really John and Carla Moore from Bible Land Passages. That's what they're called. And they do these trips once or twice a year. And it is all members of the Lord's Church. And so we were with 42 members of the Lord's Church from all over the country, and it was absolutely wonderful. So the idea is we're going to go through these pictures, and I'm going to explain a lot of it, and Richard's going to interject his thoughts whenever we come across the ones that he wants to talk about. And so let's go back and forth between the two of us, and hopefully you'll be encouraged by what you see. So here we are on the Sea of Galilee, and one of the most beautiful moments that we had the entire time we were there was a sunrise devotional right there on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. This was Jack Lachlan who gave the devotional. Each one of us men gave a devotional or a prayer or something like that in order to start off the day or to emphasize every place we went. And that was just absolutely beautiful to be there on sunrise at the Sea of Galilee. You can see the city of Tiberias right across the sea there. Afterwards, we had a chance to just reflect, and so we all spread out, and Andrea and I went off to the side and just had one of the most memorable prayers that we will ever have. And so,
just a quick thought. The Sea of Galilee was a lot smaller than I thought it was going to be. Somehow I just imagined it a sea, you know. It was about 7.5 miles across, maybe 13 miles long. You couldn't see the length of it, but it crosses as you just said, it's 7. You can see the other shore. That was surprising. And what really settled me a little bit was that morning it was like glass, like a swimming pool. And I kept trying to imagine what would it. I mean, the historic events around where Jesus quieted the seas and they in the boat were terrified of their lives. I said, this is a relatively small body of water, and it's like a swimming pool. I just tried to imagine how that could have been. And then, as Troy just points out, in the afternoon, just the winds coming in through the mountains across that sea started creating whitecaps. This was not a storm. This was just the winds coming across the mountains. So you can see pretty quickly that in a reasonable-sized boat like they were in, this could be a pretty terrifying moment in a hurry. So that was a big surprise to a lot of us, I think.
yes, and so the way that is situated, as you can see there with those mountains, when those winds come in, and like you said, it was just a relatively light wind, but the whitecaps, you would not want to be out there in the middle of that big giant lake, that sea, because it is a long ways to the shore. Now, it was very smooth, as he said there in the mornings. We got an opportunity to go out on a boat and be there on the Sea of Galilee. We took several moments of just silence. It's just incredible just to be able to sit there and talk about, for example, the verse that you see there is the verse of Jesus calming the sea. So you can imagine with a big wind and at night, it would be very scary to be out there. And how deep is it? 140 feet deep or something?
Yeah, it's almost unfathomably deep.
Yeah,
and
so
the fishing is amazing. I mean, the fish were everywhere.
And by the way, they have restored the Lake of Galilee or Sea of Galilee to its sea levels because they were draining it off for drinking water. But now they have desalination plants that they are using so that they're not drinking the water from the Sea of Galilee. Now in the background there you see Mount Arbel. I never actually knew anything about Mount Arbel. I knew a lot of other areas around there, but they took us up on that mountain, and from up on top of there you can see so far. And it wasn't the most clear day, but you could still see so very far. And this is one of the places that they believe that is where Jesus may have delivered the Sermon on the Mount, because all of the elements are there. The rocky ground that he would have talked about for the seed and the sower, all the different things that he could have pointed to looking out across Mount Arbel there across the sea.
John Moore was really good about when he was describing these events or these locations. He said, this is possible, this is probable, this is certain. And there are very, very few, this is certain. But this is one of those they said is highly probable. He and Denny both said, again, because even in that day, this was described as the Mount. And so when you read the scripture, they talk about going to the Mount. So they think this is a very high probability, up to a certainty, that this is where the Sermon on the Mount was preached.
So while we were in that area of Sea of Galilee, we also had the opportunity to go to several of the different communities around there. Now, fascinating thing about the Sea of Galilee is it's not changed all that much. It's still the same hills, and everything looks the same. It's one of those places that just hasn't changed in 2,000 years. And even the small little villages around there like Magdala and Capernaum. And we got to go to this place in Magdala, which, by the way, Jesus talks about in Matthew chapter 5, verse 39, that he entered into Magdala and was his custom would go into the synagogue. You're looking at a first century synagogue here that's been uncovered. And you can walk all around this, and there's little mosaics or mosaic floor that we were talking, just imagine that this could be where Paul stood or where Jesus himself stood. Just absolutely fascinating. Also there nearby is Capernaum, and we went into a synagogue there. Now this synagogue gives you a better idea of what they would look like, but this was constructed in the 2nd or 3rd century and over the site of the original synagogue. So even still, we know this is a place in that area where Jesus would have moved and worked and come out, because in Matthew chapter 4, verse 13, it says that he made his home, that became his base of operations, if you will, there in Capernaum. And it was just a beautiful little town. It still looks very similar to the way it did, except this big giant looking thing is a Catholic church. So basically everywhere in the Holy Lands, what they call the Holy Lands, if there's a holy site, somebody's already built a church on top of it, or they're building more churches. We went to the traditional baptismal site, and there's churches popping up all around there. You have Catholic churches, Coptic, Armenian, Orthodox, all these different churches. And in some cases, one church and all 4 or 5 of them are in there together, like the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So here, that is believed to be Peter's home. Now, there's a lot, again, going back to the probability, there's a lot of archaeological evidence. There's all kinds of different historical evidence that points to this very possibly being the home where Jesus entered into and healed Peter's mother-in-law. And so they literally built a church over it. It is suspended over this home, and you go inside this church, and there's a big piece of glass, and you can look down into the home. So it's very strange.
It is different. And what's interesting, you see the greenery. You see the greenery in the background? This home was right on the Sea of Galilee. Literally, again, Peter was a fisherman. And if that was his home, and again, they're saying this is a possible to probable, he literally, from his home to the sea, was 50 yards. It was amazing how close it was in Capernaum.
Yeah, that picture you saw where it was white capping, that was taken at Capernaum when we were there, and it was very interesting. So another thing is, before we're not really doing this in the order that we saw these, but this is still in the Jordan Valley there, and also around the Jezreel Valley. But this is Tel Jericho. This is where the old city of Jericho was, the Jericho that we read about in Joshua, that everybody went, that the Israelites first took. This is the first city that God gave to the Israelites through marching around it. And what you're seeing there is a tell, and a tell is a hill where there's been a previous civilization that was destroyed, or city, I should say, and then they build on top of that, and it gets destroyed, and they build on top of that, and it winds up making this bigger hill. So what you're seeing there are excavations going down, looking at those different levels of destruction. There's all kinds of pottery, all kinds of different things that they find that they know what is there. The most interesting thing about this tale is, you remember the story of Joshua, and they went around the city 7 times. It says they blew the trumpets and they shouted out, and what happened? The walls fell flat. Well, in this place, they found archaeological evidence where these mud bricks, which would be on top of the revetment walls, fell outwards, making a ramp that the people could go right up into the city. That never happens, by the way, in the destruction of a city. It's always knocked in with battering rams and things like that. Another fascinating thing that I found about this, which I wrote about last week in the bulletin article, was the view. You're standing up there and you can look across and you can see just over there the mountains of Moab. You can see the plains of Moab. And so you can just imagine this area where the Israelites came in and camped. You could easily see millions of people imagining seeing millions of people out there across there, all those campfires, all that movement and everything that's taking place, and then knowing those spies were coming over and eventually they were coming over. So that's the view Rahab had, looking out across the valley there, and it just was kind of overwhelming just to be there and see that and see how all that was transferred. Oldest city in the world, by the way, the oldest city in the world. We also visited another tell. This is tell Shiloh, and this is very fascinating. You remember in Joshua 18, verse 1, whenever they entered in and they had finished taking the land, that they then set the tabernacle in Shiloh. This is also where Samuel was in 1 Samuel chapter 1 through 3. This is where Hannah prayed. This is where Elkanah served. This is where Samuel served. This is where Eli served and died. Well, what you're seeing there, all that work, all those walls, that was all under dirt just 7 years ago. And that's because of this man right here, Scott Stripling, who I believe is a member of the Lord's church. And he is the director of Excavations. He's from Katy, Texas, and he's been going there for 7 years, and he's been digging. He's got 7 more years, and he just had this idea that the proposed sites that people were saying that the tabernacle was not correct. And so he started digging in where he thought it might be, and he found a wall that dates back to the Bronze period, which is the time of the Israelites. And then he found a corner, and he found another corner, and then he found a third corner, and when he measured them, they are the exact area of the atrium, the exact dimensions of the atrium of the tabernacle. And there's all kinds of storerooms right there, which would have been exactly what they need for all the different animals and stuff like that.
What was fun, while we were there, he said, just to the other part, he is quite convinced they're about to find the location of the Holy of Holies, a place where actually the Ark of the Covenant would have resided. So he said they'll know soon enough, and we're looking for him to publish those results. But it was just absolutely, it just gives you chills when you look at it and experience that.
Yeah, what you're seeing there is the live dig. So we walked right through all that. He came and gave a speech to us, and they're sitting there digging. And as I was filming, as this one guy was digging, he's like, oh, here's a piece of pottery. 2,000-year-old pottery. So it was really cool just to see all that. And I'll give a presentation about this, more about biblical Shiloh and what he's doing, coming up July the 17th, whenever I'll be filling in for Trevor. You're going to miss that, Trevor. This is another tell I want you to see. This is Tell Megiddo. And I know you can't see the picture very well, but now you kind of understand it's a hill. This is Megiddo, the Megiddo where Solomon set up fortresses, because it's in the valley of Jezreel, right before you go into the Carmel Mountains. There's only certain ways that you can get up into Jerusalem. So this was right at the entrance of one of those pathways, which is why it's set up as a fortress. Well, it's also the place, you might remember in 2 Kings 23, verse 29, that Josiah went and fought with Pharaoh Necho and was killed at Megiddo. Revelation 16, verse 16, talks about Armageddon. That is Har Megiddo, the valley of Megiddo. It's talking about a place, the Jezreel Valley, where you have all these wars that have been fought, like Deborah and Barak, Gideon, the one I just mentioned with Josiah. Is simply a place where a battle took place. And there's a real place called Megiddo, and it's very similar to the ones we showed you with Shiloh, as well as the one there at Jericho. Another place that we visited, another tell that was fascinating, was Tell Beth Shan, or Bet Shan, or different ways. They have all kinds of ways that they say these things, especially our guide, Zvika, who is Jewish. But Tell Beth Shan is important because this, according to 1 Samuel 31:10, is where King Saul took his own life. You remember whenever he was surrounded by the Philistines and he told his armor bearer to pierce him through because he didn't want to fall into the hands of the Philistines, and the armor bearer wouldn't do it. So he fell on his own sword, and here him and his son Jonathan died, and it was here that the men came and took him, and because they had posted his body up, and so they came, they took him, and they buried him. That happened right there at Tel Beth Shan. At the foot of Tel Beth Shan, they discovered a city. The city that you see there, Scythopolis, is one of the cities of the Decapolis. And what's interesting, all that you're seeing right there, all those columns, all that theater and everything else, every bit of that was under dirt just 45 years ago. About 45 years ago, a farmer was out there in his tractor, and he was plowing, and he hit a rock. And he got off of his tractor, and he went down to see what the rock was, and he uncovered the top of one of those columns, the pillar of one of those columns. And he made a terrible mistake. He called the Israeli Archaeological Agency, and whenever they discover something, all of a sudden, you're going to basically lose that land. And so, but they uncovered this entire city that had just been forgotten. One of the towns of the Decapolis that Jesus talks about in Mark 7, verse 31, that he entered into and preached in the different cities of the Decapolis. So it's very possible that Jesus might have walked this street right here with those Roman columns, which you can still see today. You can walk all through all that, see the mosaic floor, all kinds of things, a bathhouse, just a glimpse. You think of Rome, right? When you think of Roman cities, well, there's a Roman city that's been discovered there in Israel.
They have stood all those columns back up. The only column that survived the earthquake is the one the farmer hit, which is fascinating.
Now, I'll turn this over to you on this one. Where are we at?
This was the moment that I've been waiting for. There's 2 or 3 moments that were just kind of on your bucket list. This is the Valley of Elah. This is the location of the battle of David and Goliath. So again, the opposing armies on each one of these hills. You have the composite picture you took of,
Yes.
with you?
I think so.
There you are. That's a better picture. So you can see, this is a composite. They're not quite that close, but you can see the warring armies would have been on either side. They were close enough to have shouted and again, kind of vexed each other. But that is the location in that valley where actually David took the life of Goliath. And that is a certainty.
Now, we also went to, it's impossible to show you every single thing that we did and every place that we went to, but one of the places we went to that was quite fascinating is this mountain, this hill, this high area called Nebi Samuel. Now, you think about high area. This is one of the highest areas there in Israel, and up on top of there was a church and is now what is supposedly the resting place of Samuel the prophet. And so a lot of the Orthodox Jews go up to this place and they pray there and they touch the tomb of Samuel. But from there you can look out across and see what Israel looks like in all directions. And this is just one direction, and it gives you an idea of how hilly that is. And one thing that we came to the realization real quick, as especially Miss Ruth is such a trooper and went up and down those hills and walked all those miles, is that Jesus and the apostles were in very good shape. They were in very good shape because, wow, those hills they're way bigger. It's hard to see it. But this hill country. And so from there, we're able to look out across this area, and to get to the Valley of Elah, you got to go down through this valley. On the other side of that ridge you're seeing right there is a little valley, a ridge. And on the left is Jerusalem, back here to your left, and you go down this valley and work your way down into the Valley of Elah, where we were just a moment ago. And as we were driving down through there, our guide said, oh, by the way, you're on the road to Emmaus. It's the same road. It's a highway now, but there's only certain ways to get down out of Jerusalem, and they always put the roads down in the valley, and here we are on a highway, but this is the same hills and towns and everything else that those 2 men would have seen. So, Casey was preaching that Sunday when we got back about the road to Emmaus, and it was just all this imagery was coming to my mind. It was incredible. This right here is another one. So I told you Jerusalem was there, and then you go down to the Valley of Elah. If you go the other direction, you go down this way, which is called the Wadi Kelt, or the Ascent of Adumim. And this was when we were down in the Dead Sea, down in the lower Jordan Valley. We're coming up out of that valley from Jericho. Jericho is just to your right, down that valley right there, and to your right is Jericho, and off to the distance there, that's the Dead Sea. And I know you can't see it real well, but back in the distance there in the top right corner. So you're coming up out of this, what's called the Wadi Kelt. A wadi is simply a dry riverbed, and that thing turns into a big river when it rains. Well, this is where we believe that David wrote Psalm 23. that though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. This is the same place that Joshua brought the Israelites up through. This is also one of the borders of the land that was divided up into the different tribes, as well as where Elijah would have traveled down through in 1 Kings 17:3, and the story of the Good Samaritan. And from our point of view, we could see crags and things like that in the rock where robbers could have hidden. And if you can look real close where that arrow is pointing, there's a little tiny path that winds down through there, and it was just incredible to see.
The part that was, so, I guess, most surprising for me is when you talk about them, going into the wilderness, I just thought it like unexplored lands, like you're walking through the Appalachian Trail. It's this. It was desert. It is barren. It is harsh, hilly. The circumstances they were dealing with was far more severe than I would ever have imagined. It was quite awakening.
So coming up from the lower Jordan Valley up through the Wadi Kelt, and like I said, there's so many other things that we'd love to show you. We just don't have time. Like we went to Masada and we went to Qumran and places like that. But we want to get to Jerusalem because this is where we saw a lot of things. And this was a view of Mount Olives. And that's our group. That's the entire group there. Down on the right there, that's John and Carla Moore. Many of you know them. The Manns are in there. Dave and Adina Mann are in there, as well as several folks from Bear Valley and other people from all over the United States. This was the view that we had. And from Mount Olive, looking over at the Temple Mount, over at Old Jerusalem, John Moore gave one of the most beautiful devotionals I've ever heard, and talking about all kinds of things about the Mount of Olives. For example, in Matthew 24, verse 3, it says that Jesus went up on the Mount of Olives, and that's where the disciples came to him and said, when will these things happen? When will these things take place that you're talking about? We're talking about the destruction of the temple. He's looking down over at the temple and describing to them all the things you read about in Matthew chapter 24 and 25. In Luke 22, verse 39, this is where he goes. Whenever he constantly went over to the Garden of Eden, it says he even goes as far in 24:50 to Bethany. Bethany's just right behind us. And it's from this point, according to the Bible, that he would have ascended back to heaven. It's from this point, it's believed, that he even gave the Great Commission. So many things that happened here on Mount of Olives.
Go ahead.
Okay.
I've got some thoughts. I'll save them for the next.
From the other direction, now if you go to the other side of Jerusalem, looking back, this is on top of Herod's palace on the other side of Jerusalem. You can look back and you can see Mount Scopus to the left and Mount of Olives there to the right, and then to the right of that is the Hill of Offense. And what's interesting about the Mount of Olives is there's all these people that are buried there. That reason it looks kind of like land there is because those are all graves where people have been buried.
That was a graveyard long before the time of Jesus, and has continued to be a graveyard to this day.
You see some of the graves there.
Yeah. So, and again, people, because the idea was that when the Messiah comes, they wanted to be at close proximity, so be the first to experience that. The Mount of Olives was much closer to the gates and the boundaries of Jerusalem than I ever imagined. The Garden of Gethsemane, we're going to see that in just a moment. This location is an absolute. This is the Garden of Gethsemane. That olive tree on the right is arguably 2,000 years old. Again, these trees, they just don't die. You can cut them off and they just sprout again. So you're actually on the spot in the place where Jesus and the disciples met and spent that last evening. It was beyond moving. The thing that also struck me is this is so much closer to the city than we had ever. You have the Kidron Valley pictures in a minute. Okay, well I'll save that for just a moment. But this is much closer to the city than I ever imagined. And in the garden, you could literally see the city. And when the temple guard came to arrest Jesus, he could have seen them literally from the time they departed the gate all the way through the valley of Kidron until they got to the garden. So their arrival was not a surprise. It was surprising how close it was and how intimate this space is.
The interesting thing about the Garden of Gethsemane is a couple of things. One is you can't walk inside there anymore, and there's a church off to the left that you can go into, and they, like I said, they build a church over every spot. They have identified the very stone that Jesus prayed on, and so that's now below an altar. As you walk into the church, you can go up to the front of the church, and you can touch that stone, supposedly where Jesus prayed. The other thing about the Garden of Gethsemane is that it is now, like I said, it's locked off, or it is fenced off, I should say, because everybody, all the tourists, was taking a little olive branch. And after a few million tourists, there won't be any more olive trees left, so they finally closed that off. But you can still get right there and see it. Andrea and I tried to just stop and read the account of Jesus praying in the Garden of Gethsemane in Matthew 26, and you can't do it. We tried. We read as much as we could. We cried. We prayed. And it's just a beautiful, beautiful moment. And then, as Richard was saying, going into the Kidron Valley, just to the left. I mean, what you're seeing right there, literally just to the left. I can turn around from where I'm standing, took this picture, and look right there, and there's the Garden of Gethsemane as he was describing. And this was one of our big moments. Before we ever even went to Israel, I asked Richard, I said, what's your big moment you're waiting on? He said, the Kidron Valley. So you're looking down through it. It hasn't changed that much. Those are still olive trees down in there. And as you progress down into the valley, you can walk down in there. I want you to notice how steep that hill is in the back. So Jerusalem is up on a big, big hill. I mean, they're looking down, way down. So behind me, you see behind us there's Jack with us as well. You see this pathway coming down. They're pretty certain that's the pathway that they would have taken all those years. But the Kidron Valley was just one of those places that was very special to us because that's where I believe Jesus gave what you read in John 13 through 16, and 17, when he's walking to the Garden of Gethsemane and he's saying all those things like, I am the way, the truth, and the life. He's on the way. And after he says all those things, and they're all upset, I believe it's right there in that area where he stopped and said, let's pray. And then that incredible prayer in John 16 and 17. And then at the end of John 17, in chapter 18, verse 1, it says what? They crossed over the brook Kidron. So right there in that area was a special moment for me. I sat down. There's an olive tree right there in a little area right in the very bottom of the Kidron Valley. And I just had a personal and prayer, and it was just a wonderful moment for me.
Yeah, I had that same experience. The one big aha moment here was when you read the history of them leaving and walking the Valley Kidron, I just imagine them walking away from the city. But they came out of that southern gate and then walked along the walls of the city and then came back up and crossed up to the Garden of Gethsemane. So they were traveling this way. They weren't far from the city walls at any one point. It was surprising, again, how close everything was.
Yeah, in fact, somebody like Jake, maybe, he could probably throw a football from one side to the other, right? Yeah. That's how close it is.
It's a 9-iron.
Yeah, or a 9-iron, there you go. So there also in Jerusalem, we got to obviously go to the Western Wall. Now, what's interesting about the Western Wall is that it is divided. There's a men's side and a women's side. There's a big of Hasidic Jews, Orthodox Hasidic Jews that are growing there and populating more and more population that are very divided, how do I say that they believe everything should be divided. So even in the Sea of Galilee, we stayed in this resort where there was a women's side and a men's side for going into the sea, for swimming and all, and everywhere you go. And so there at the Western Wall, which is not called the Wailing Wall anymore, it's the Western Wall. This is the base. This is not the wall of the temple. This is what the temple stood on. And there on the bottom there, those are Herodian stones. Those are stones that were laid by King Herod, who built that temple that was there in the time of Jesus. Just a little bit above that, those stones were from the Byzantine or the Ottoman Empire or something along that line. And then the very top stones were added by the Crusaders in the 16th century.
And the original stones and wall are about 30 feet lower than that surface you're seeing right here. We have a chance in a moment to go down below and see the original stones. But that wall was much bigger than what you're even seeing here.
Remember what I talked about with the tale, how things get built on top of each other? Well, even in Jerusalem, the actual walking, the place where you would walk is actually 30 feet. Everything in Israel is 30 feet below where you're walking. And so that's the case here. So we did go down. We went into, there's Jack and Richard there touching the western wall. And the western wall is really just a small section of the entire base of the Temple Mount. So what you're seeing right there, this is down below, and a picture that they showed of this is all you're seeing. And notice how it goes down below. Well, now we are to the left of that and down. You see where that bridge is going up into that gate? We are right below that gate when we came upon this, which is the Herodian stone. These are the stones that is talked about whenever Jesus was confronting them, and they said, it's taken, 40 plus years to build this temple, and you're going to destroy it in 3 days? Well, no wonder, because a stone like this right here is believed to weigh 500 tons. And so they quarried this stone up the hill, rolled it down, put it in this place, and then there's a tunnel that you can go through that goes all along the base of the western wall, the western revetment wall, the wall of the mound, the temple mound.
The little cutouts you see, they use that to build another wall. They literally would take like plugs and put them in and put a second wall on the outside to seal it up for water and things like that. So those were carved out later. But that is a 1 million pound stone, far bigger than any stone used in the pyramids, for instance.
And much heavier.
Yeah.
When he mentions that about that they did that, you got to remember that Jerusalem was destroyed in AD 70. And then the Roman city was built on top of Jerusalem, and then that was destroyed. And then an Ottoman city was built on that. And then the Crusaders came, and so what they did is they used this area right here for cisterns. And so, as he said, they dug those holes, and that original stone didn't have those holes in there, but they had to do that in order to attach plaster to build a cistern. So they were using the wall of the Temple Mount for a cistern and using all kinds of different stuff.
They never let a good stone go to waste.
That's right. In fact, there at Shiloh, they found in the wall of another building many years later that was built hundreds of years later, that was actually the corner of an altar, a horned altar. And so, funny stuff. Now, go back the other direction. So we went to the left of the western wall and saw that stone and went underground. If you go back the other direction, the other side, they uncovered all this. Everything you're seeing there. In fact, in the background, you can see how high the ground was. They dug down and they found these stones, all these giant stones that basically the Romans knocked off or pushed off of the Temple Mount, and it fell down and crushed the pavement stones. You can see them all bent and busted and everything else. This is part of the pilgrimage road that goes all the way back down to the Pool of Siloam, and they're all still there for you to see today. Incredible evidence of destruction. And then, what else do we have? Okay, the southern steps. So, you see that black dome right there in the middle? On the other side of that black dome, that's the western wall. So if you go down that western wall where we just were, and then you come back this way, what you're seeing there where the arrow's pointing is the southern wall, the wall that faces the south. And there's some steps that go up this southern wall, and there used to be some entrances, some gates right there that all of the people would come into the temple. Now, the southern steps are interesting because they're different lengths and heights so that you do not approach the temple haphazardly or without reverence. You have to bow down and pay attention and go into the temple. But an even more important event happened, we believe, here in the southern steps.
Yeah, so this is one that John Moore says is a probable and possibly near certain that this would have been the location that Peter would have preached the first gospel sermon. And while we were sitting on those steps, we had a gentleman, John Kallenbach. John Kallenbach memorized Peter's speech from Acts, the 2nd chapter, and recited it with emotion and feeling like a human being speaks on those steps. And that was a moment that literally, it shook me for the rest of the afternoon. I'll never read Acts 2 the same again. But that is a very high probable spot where Peter preached that first gospel sermon.
So in that, stay right there. So in that gospel sermon, you remember what happened in Acts chapter 2, verse 41? It says, how many were baptized? 3,000, right? And you think, how could you baptize 3,000 people? That's a lot of people. Well, it just so happens all around that area were these mikvahs, these baths, these ritual baths that the Jews would use. So they would go down into these baths. They're all over the place. There's dozens and dozens of them. They would go down into these places and cleanse themselves before going up into the temple. In fact, the pool of Siloam is the same thing. It's a ritual bath, and then you go up to the temple. And there were tons of these all around. So would it be possible to baptize 3,000 people that afternoon?
Would have been simple.
I mean, look how big that one is that Richard and I are in. And there's lots of
dozens and dozens of them.
So just amazing. And some even still have water in them.
Yeah.
And then another aspect of that, at the top of those steps, there's this one place where you have this stone that is exposed. A lot of this has been recreated or been replicated or restored, but in this case, they leave a lot of the original. And this stone right here is the same stone that was there in the first century. It's right in front of the triple gate there. So it's very, very possible that Jesus stepped on that stone, or the apostles for sure stepped on that very stone. And so just little moments. You're overwhelmed by so much opportunity to reflect on what the scriptures say and see it come to life. Real quick, here's some few pictures of walking through the streets of Jerusalem. We had an opportunity one Sunday afternoon, Jack and Sherry and Richard and Ruth and Andrew and myself, we just walked around the streets of Jerusalem, stopped and had coffee, stopped and had some falafel, some shawarma, and it was a great day just getting to see this. This was on Jerusalem Day, which, by the way, is unification of Jerusalem whenever they unified. And that, while we were walking, I came across this and have some of this in my office. I bought some. You see in a lot of movies like Indiana Jones where you go into these stores and they have all these spices and stuff. Well, right there was a spice store, literally like that, in the bowls, these spices, and one of them was frankincense and myrrh. Now, the interesting thing about that is we went into the the church of the Holy Sepulchre. And there is a stone there that they believe that they prepared the body of Jesus. Once he had died from the cross, they laid him on this stone, and they prepared him. Remember what the Bible says in John 19 and 39, that they came and they brought frankincense as one of the spices that they used to preserve the body. And what you're seeing right there in those little plastic things is frankincense and myrrh and some other things that people would leave. They'd leave candles. They would kiss it. They would bring olive oil and put on it. And the interesting thing about the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is a lot of things interesting about it, but is how, once again, how close everything is. I took these pictures that I want you to see. On the right, at the top, is where supposedly the cross was put in. There's a hole there that you can go up to and put your hand in and feel the hole that they supposedly put the cross. Right down from that, and where you see all those little bells and other things and those people, that's that slab where they supposedly prepared the body. And then just to your left, you just turn and you see this edicule, which is the supposedly tomb of Jesus.
So let me just say this real quickly just to clear this up. There's a reason why we don't know all this stuff, where it exactly is, because we would do exactly what those people are doing, which is turning these edifices into objects of worship, which is not what we're supposed to do in any circumstance. But I'll just say that and then we'll go on. They said this is probable, highly probable. These are locations that are appropriate because the government at the time built the temple of Venus over this spot to keep the Christians from pilgrimaging there. Constantine came, destroyed this temple of Venus, and then they built this edifice. So the location of where the crucifixion occurred and the location of where the burial occurred is really close. It's surprisingly close. I just envision it much, much further. Real quickly, so there was a hill, Golgotha, there was a mine where they mined the limestone that they used to build, the city with. And whenever you had a flat spot after they mined it, any flat spot was now a place you could possibly farm. There was a garden there. So the flat surfaces is where they built the tombs. They carved out the tombs. Then you had a garden, which is, again, Mary believed that when she first saw Jesus the first time, he might have been the gardener. There was a garden there. So it was a garden here, a flat surface. There were the tombs. And just up the hill, that's Golgotha. And just on the other side is where they threw the bodies of the unfortunates that they just threw them off for disposal. But where the crucifixion occurred, again, based on this location, and where he was actually entombed, was just a matter of just yards. It wasn't a great distance at all. It was in very close proximity.
I found it amazing. I never dawned on me that all three things are right there in that one building, and so it's quite amazing. And then we did go to what is called the Garden Tomb, which is another possible location, and right next to it is a hill that's called Golgotha that looks like a skull. A lot of times you see this tomb and it's so beautiful, and and it has that he is risen. Well, this is the reality. There's tons and tons and tons of people winding through there to go into that tomb. Last couple of quick pictures I'll share with you. That is Cave 4 at Qumran. We'll talk about this whenever I give a class, and that is where they discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls. That was a big moment for me because I'm a big archaeology fan, and just the Dead Sea Scrolls changed scholarship of Bible scholarship so much. And then this one is the Pilate inscription. This is a replica of that, and that is a stone that you can see today. That actual stone was taken from right there in that area in Caesarea Maritima, where Herod had a palace, where all the governors wound up having their administrative center. And there is this big theater there. And they found this stone that has Pontius Pilate's name on it. And what does that tell you? It tells you that you can trust what this says. Well, this, as I mentioned, was Bible Land Passages. John and Carla Moore are the ones that do this. If you'd like more information about these trips, they would love to have you go along with them. See me or Richard or Andrea, Ruth, any of them, we'll be glad to put you in touch with them. Let's now make application. Thanks so much, brother. That was very enjoyable.